Well, thanks everyone for being here. We're officially going to go and get started now. We've got a good sized crew here. So excited to share some insights with you all around how we can do this, cut the time to value in half for your design system, particularly for teams that are either sort of just getting started or restarted, as we often find is the case. I'm Andrew. I lead customer success here at Knapsack, and I'll be sharing some insights that we've really learned mostly from working with system and product teams about how they've achieved some of these goals and found success. And I'm joined by Mr. Bloom.
Hey, I'm Chris Bloom, principal front-end engineer here at Knapsack. I've implemented a lot of design systems for a lot of different folks, and it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I tend to be on the technical side of things, and I'm excited to be here with Andrew today.
Awesome. So, today is really about how do we get to value quickly, right? Especially for those teams getting started. And we've got some really good news to start off with for you all. Designing and coding a system isn't actually all that difficult, right? Now, it might be a spicy take, but the point here is that actually doing the design, the coding, even defining processes, that's not ultimately the hard part for your talented teams, right? It's time consuming, it takes strategy, and it's something that we need to take a lot of care in, but it's not necessarily the difficult part to actually build the system. And I'd also point out that actually building the system isn't really your goal. Right? We talk a lot about this. This is often the focus, and we're going to get into how that can actually be a distraction sometimes. But typically, I would guess that your goals are either somewhere on this list or maybe this entire list. And again, it turns out that these don't magically suddenly happen once we have a system. Or building the system does not mean that our goals here have been met. And this is why you've probably heard us say before, if you've attended any of our webinars or had a meeting with us, that design systems are really, and getting the value out of systems are really much more about the behaviors of our teams than the stuff that we put in the system that we've designed and built. And today we want to just dig into that behavior priority just a little bit more and focus on specifically how engaging system users can lead us to value, and really quickly. But you don't need to take our word for it that this is a worthwhile place to spend some time. If we look at the most recent iteration of Sparkbox's annual survey that they do of design system practitioners, we will see that 3 of the top 4 priorities and challenges are really explicitly related to how systems are actually used by product teams, right? Adoption, obviously, contribution from teams that are using the system, and then overcoming the technical and creative debt in the product that, again, one of our top goals. It's actually the biggest challenge, right? So we're really struggling with where it comes to the rubber hitting the road, so to speak, and the teams using the system to actually make us successful. And what's more is that the majority of teams that noted adoption as a challenge in that survey were really not successful, right? In their effort, they self-reported as being moderately, slightly, or just not successful. And conversely, those who were successful didn't really mention adoption as a challenge, right? So what's the takeaway here? Success is really, really tightly tied to engagement. And so we should focus on how we engage users really early and really often. Probably not that crazy of a concept in the world of product development, but something that often gets sort of lost here. And again, if you want to get to value quickly, we got to be smart about our milestones, focus on building momentum and engagement over focusing on the completeness of the system. And we're going to find that we sort of get above that horizon and start to see value a lot more quickly. So that all sounds great. Cool. How do we actually do that? Right? Let's get a little more tactical specific here. We want to share a couple of very specific tips on what we're seeing teams that sort of leverage and embrace to get the value fast. So tip 1, define your quote unquote minimum viable system, right? This is all about how do we prove out something that's complete, but at a small scale so that we can then scale it and grow it from there. Right? We often hear teams working on their system without a clear idea of how or when it will be first leveraged in the product, right? And so that's an immediate flag, right? We want to make sure that we're mapping to something that is complete, but also small, and we can scope down so that we can live through sort of that full life cycle with a system element or part of our system. We really focus on this as a small set of content and behaviors, processes, a component, some tokens, that are necessary to demonstrate that repeatable motion for the important part, enabling product teams to leverage the design system, right? A lot of times we may build the MVP system, but actually validation of it being consumed or used in a product isn't part of that scope, right? Again, immediately we haven't actually shown the whole thing. We've only shown part of a workflow, part of a value, and it's hard to scale something that's incomplete. So it's probably not by surprise, based on what we've said so far, that we're going to point at engagement as a key factor in defining the exact scope of that minimum viable system, right? We look at what is the nearest point at which we can engage users and start to see value. And that's where we're going to start to encapsulate in that system. So what does that look like? There's, three big buckets of sort of small, medium, large in terms of effort and time. The teams that we see literally in days just get up and running and start working this way are those that frankly don't focus on building the system at all. They focus purely on enabling this way of working that's based on capturing and reusing stuff, solutions that have been built to problems, especially commonly occurring problems, right? These teams focus on the fact that good design and engineering is happening, and the organization will benefit if teams share and leverage each other's solutions to those commonly reoccurring problems. Right? It is just full tilt embracing the whole behaviors over assets mentality. Doesn't work for everyone. Obviously, if you have an existing baseline, that's a challenge. But I love seeing teams do this because it shows that behavior is what's going to get us results. It's focused on behaviors, and we're going to build our system as we go. So there's obviously some tooling set up, user enablement, but this is much more about building the process and the operation than it is actually about building anything in the system. Slides work. If we go on to the sort of medium bucket, this is where really I think is the most popular approach we see at Knapsack with our customers. You may have a system that doesn't have the things you think are in it at the end of this, but it's actually going to be really effective at advancing your roadmap and gaining adoption, which I would take that every time. And so what this looks like is building really the absolute minimum you need to support something in the roadmap, right? And then we're embracing the fact that it's not going to be perfect, it's not comprehensive, but we're going to continue to capture things, reuse elements, and improve them as we go. A few weeks ago, we heard, or a couple months ago, from Tommy at Rumbix, one of our customers, who talked about this approach after they had tried to build the big MVP and failed. And he was talking about how his teams are leaving the system better than they found it. We're able to just kind of start organically growing that system, which is so powerful. And they started with just some tokens and a progress bar. And then, of course, sometimes it does take a while, right? We've got to build back to an existing baseline or just some massive complex org that we have that requires us to bite off something more substantial and get more people involved. And so, the key here is still scope it down as much as you can, right? This should still never be a complete system in our initial launch or our MVP, right? Maybe it's just enough to cover one subset of the site or one product or one feature. But the key is scope it to something really, really specific, so you can get clarity all the way through to the end, right, to implementation. If we're just generically working towards grand coverage of our site and all the things we think should be in our system, it's really hard for us to ever say that we've demonstrated something that we can scale, right? We're just kind of working towards a really amorphous endpoint. So it's still, even in this case, you may go big, but it's not a complete system. I'd very much think of it as a very targeted scope. But the good side is when you do something larger, you do have a bit of a larger scale of impact and visibility that you can point to. So it's certainly not all a downside, and it's a practical reality of many enterprise teams. I just noticed a question, by the way. Yes, Sandy, we are recording this and we'll be sharing, and we're happy to send out the slides as well at the end of this. No problem. Let's show a little bit about how we do this with our customers at Knapsack. We're very milestone driven. This is from our onboarding process, right? So customers have kicked the tires and made sure that Knapsack works within their environment, their tool stack. But then we immediately are really focused on this goal. How do we deliver value as quickly as possible in a week or a few weeks by really, really scoping down that MVS and understanding who's going to pilot it so that we can then know what we're going to scale. And that's what adoption becomes about in the grander sense. It's about taking what we learned and piloted and just pouring gas on that fire and growing our practice. So a few examples of how that kind of looks as we tend to go through this planning process. Example of where it often starts, what's crossed out is I think our MVP is a solid V1. It's probably got a lot of foundational work in it, every basic component that we need. Totally get the thinking there, but that's a lot to bite off, and without a clear idea of exactly how it's going to be used. We just have a theory of how it'll be used. And so through some discussion, we often get to let's actually ship the component and the button component rather. And let's get really specific around what we're supporting. Let's get the tokens to get it there. Let's make sure our tools and infrastructure is in place. Show that we can change and ship something. And then at the very least, get a product team to say, yeah, I could totally use that button, right? Even if we don't incorporate it all the way in the product, we've lived through the whole thing, right? The tooling, the operation, the tokens, the component, the design, and validation from product that they could use it, which is the payoff moment. Now we know we have a practice we can scale, and we can do that in weeks, if not, less. And then, in terms of what that looks like, we get really granular on the buckets, if you will, of kind of what boxes do we need to check. Documentation, including design guidelines, the specs, the tokens needed to support our scope, obviously the component itself. There's technical and tooling setup, and there's some, process, how are we going to use it? And then sometimes, we got to figure out the pilot team, or there's some other things. But these are the 5 or 6 buckets that if we address all of these, even though the scope and answer may look different for each team, we know that we're going to be in a good position to have that demonstrable process that we can scale. And then again, it's also very important to get tight on what you're not doing, right? We try and be clear around what's in this MBS and when is that, and then, what's maybe a few months out, what's a few months out. And often we discover opportunities by way of this, because, if you take this approach of building for the most important priorities, you can start to look at where are there opportunities to leverage what we've built. And it's a very sort of in line with your product roadmap, which we're going to talk about here in a second as well. So tip 1, scope a minimum viable system, be very intentional, and make sure that we're going to get that all the way through to the end, so we know we have a full process we can scale and repeat. Tip 2, just mentioned this one, we're going to map to our product roadmap. Right. So really often we see design system teams waving their system in the air and trying to build momentum and get excitement from product leaders and commit cycles and sprints to get the system incorporated. And I get it, but it's a lot of swimming upstream, right? Swimming against the current of your existing product org. And there's a lot of opportunity here to actually do the opposite, right? Support those priorities instead of adding to them, and gain that momentum right off the bat, and even gain some favor. We see a lot of this what happen when teams are focused on that ideal system, right? They've read a bunch of articles, they have a sense of what should be in their system, they did a comprehensive pattern inventory, and they've defined it, right? Sometimes they start with like, we finished our system and design and we're getting ready to build it. Just, a very too focused on the system as opposed to the way we work. And then we have this wonderful moment of, everyone freaking out, trying to figure out how exactly is this going to fit into all our other priorities? How are we going to retrofit? All based on the roadmap, which is what your business needs to deliver to be successful. Right? That is a moment of real strain and tension, and one of the many reasons that we start to see those systems not get adopted and fall into disrepair. What's the difference is when you have a system focused on what you need to support your roadmap and not everything we think in the system, this practical design system, it's really not even a conversation, right? We had a call with one of our customers earlier today, and our guidance was, hey, as early as you can, be chatting with your product leaders, show them that your priorities are to support their priorities. And you're just going to find that it's a much less frictionful operation, and that you're going to find it's easier to gain favor, gain adoption. Really, the only downside here, again, is that your system may not have the things in it that you thought would be in it, but they're going to be the things that move your business further faster. Right? There's really no need to swim against the current here. And by the way, this was one other fact that stood out from that survey. 53% of teams that responded to the Sparkbox survey said that their design systems were creating technical debt for their product organization, which is just a little sobering as a statistic there, right? If your system is creating more strain on your product organization, we're doing something wrong, right? We're going about it the wrong way. There's a better way. Facepalm. Lastly, tip 3. Enable contribution early, right? We've talked about engagement. Engagement can mean a lot of things, but contribution specifically is something that we put a lot of emphasis on here at Knapsack, because it is one of those keys to not only adoption, but real ongoing engagement and sustainability for your system. And ultimately, it makes your life easier as a system maintainer, right? This is about helping your users help them more, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge that without contributions, your system is really just theory, right? No matter how talented the engineers and designers are that are working on the system, if we haven't proven its implementation and learned from implementations of anything, it's not fully validated, right? You may recall this from a couple of webinars ago, Dan Mall, building on a concept from Brad Frost, creator of the Atomic Design Framework, noting that the system is about how we have built products successfully as an organization, right? It's about that experience being captured and able to be leveraged by others who haven't yet lived through it. And so by definition, your system cannot be complete without factoring in the experience of the people who use it, right? Involve them early as soon as you can, or you really risk wasting a good amount of time. And what we see is a few different sort of ways this can happen. It isn't limited solely to teams that are just getting started, right? Teams that are just getting started, that I'm not going to build anything approach, contribution is what makes that sharing possible and is what engages users from the very beginning, so that they're a part of building and informing your system and not just waiting for you to come out of the cave and hand it to them. But even, the sort of middle approach that I mentioned, Tommy at Rumbix, their contribution was all about that, leaving it better than you found it, right? It enabled that sort of organic snowballing of the system based on, focusing on priorities, because designers and engineers were empowered to use it and improve it and make changes and suggest them back, not just hopefully, use it and give us some feedback in a Slack channel. And expansion, even if you're in that, you've got a mature system, you're really humming. We always hear about challenges of users not finding what they're looking for because they didn't see the relevant example, or it just wasn't quite configured how they were looking for it. Helping your teams, enabling your teams to help you curate examples of how systems have been used, or what happens at the edges of the system where it didn't solve a problem, really just help make sure that everything is a well-oiled machine and not, fizzling at the end of sort of what we can control as a small group. And a common fear we run into here from system teams is like, hey, sounds good in theory from a value standpoint, except our life just got harder, right? We've got more pull requests to review. We've got more governance flows to get through. It feels like we may lose control or just bloat the system. And I think that is a valid concern. One of the ways that we see teams do that, solve for this, is actually just lean into it with some of the way they even structure things like a workspace site or a storefront. So an example of a knapsack workspace, we've seen teams start to embrace this idea of like, yeah, I've got my official system, but I also am going to just carve out a section that is the community contributions, right? It's not the dedicated system, the officially tested and gone through all our processes, but we're going to acknowledge that I'd rather have folks share what they do at the limits of the system than just say, you're cut off, hope you figure that part out, right? And it's really, really powerful when we do that, not just in enabling the users, but what that contribution becomes is, innate adoption, right? I'm a part of this and you actually care about my voice. Those users become engaged. As the system team, you're not the sole providers, right? You're not on the hook for everything. And you've got feedback just available, right? Everyone seeing where the system isn't doing well for them or not doing it all is empowered to surface that to you without you having to go collect all that every time. And again, you're learning from people implementing it, right? You're getting validation, you're getting improvement on the system. And that's even going to help you cover gaps. And at the end of the day, it's enabling sharing and reuse, right? Even things you didn't think you need in the system, even if it's just two design teams referencing the same way they thought about a visual solution, that's so powerful, right? That's what helps the sharing of innovation, the more consistent, problem solving. A lot of those goals that we thought about, again, not about the system, it's about the behavior. And fundamentally, I think what this does is it makes your system operation a two-way conversation, and not even just between design and product. I mean, even between different product teams, right, that are having that opportunity in a curated venue provided by the system operation to share and collaborate on new solutions. Right? It's about empowering those teams to be successful despite the limitations to the system, right? Because it turns out that your system is always going to have limits, right? It is always going to be somewhat finite, but those limitations really don't need to create hurdles for your team if we're enabling them to contribute and engage all along the way. So with that, we want to turn it over to a little bit of a conversation here. I'm going to welcome Chris back into the stage. And we also will answer questions. So I see, Cassie, there's one hand raised up. If you don't mind dropping your question in the chat, or if that would work, we'll go ahead and get to that. Chris, do you want to go ahead and share? I'm just curious your thoughts on all this.
Thanks. Your slide on the priorities versus challenges with those metrics there with the bar graph, those numbers spoke volumes to me around my experiences doing implementations of many different design systems. Right, we got to see that like the reason folks went for design systems also were the downsides that people experience trying to implement design systems, right? And it's really clear to me that it is a people, not a technology situation, right? That we're looking to solve for. The people part of the design system process is vastly the most important, and anything that brings folks in early will, of course, achieve the most success.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love hearing a technologist embrace, it's people first.
People.
I've had a couple of very smart customers and members of our team, point out to us recently, especially as we dig into things like automation. Hey, how can I automate more of this to make it easier? Like, automation is an exciting promise. I don't think it really works until we figure out how to live through it as humans. It's hard to automate a process that we haven't seen through to success. Which is even, and why we are such big advocates of like, no, just pilot the button, because get it to the end, or else we haven't achieved success yet. So how are we going to scale it?
In my experience, like seeing those, there are examples of like, there's numbers there on the failed implementations of design systems. I have been on failed implementations. They are not great. It's not an awesome experience. And Andrew, what you pointed out, right, there's a pretty strong correlation purely between, the people issues of like adoption and contribution and what you could consider a success for a design system, right? So, if we want to look at these numbers and see like, okay, well, what correlates to something actually being a success in this space? And it really comes down to that engagement and that user involvement very early on. My experience with this has been the teams that have effectively gone into a cave to go build the system, right, fully from the ground up, and then they pop out a couple of months later and they're like, all right, we built it, here you go, let's use it. Almost across the board, no adoption, and probably a check mark next to the failed column for that kind of a thing. So I've been there and I've seen that, and I have been in that cave before, and it's kind of why I'm here and trying to solve the problems that we're solving.
Yeah, it's been really awesome to see teams sort of embrace that idea of like, we're just invite people into the workshop and, let's break down the transparency, break down the walls, create some more transparency. And, I have yet to see the perfect system. That I don't know if I've ever seen a done system, right? Even you go look at, I remember it was about a year or so ago, you go look at, Carbon's blog posts, and everyone points at Carbon and they're like, hey, we've realized that we've enabled people to make a bunch of different on-brand experiences, but they're all solving problems differently. So it's a constant evolution. And so that idea of like waiting for the system to be done before we use it, it just feels, increasingly like a fool's errand when there's such an opportunity to just instead embrace, a way of working.
The structured approach of like taking, getting something usable, getting that button that the teams actually incorporate, just that button and a couple of color tokens. If people are using it, that is vastly more successful than a massive system with a beautiful UI that nobody's touching.
Yeah, we've actually even seen opportunities where teams have embraced like an operational improvement that basically led to adopting a system that they hadn't fully refined yet. We have customers going through a rebrand, and they could say, we're going to build as part of our rebrand, define the whole new system and then hand it down to engineers. Or they could say, hey, we've actually given you all of your current styles through the operational tools and pipelines we need, so that you're now getting the same colors and old brand that you're implementing today. It's just a new NPM package or whatever. And then they're on the hook, right? It's an easier thing to adopt then. And then as we start to introduce new changes, change what those colors are, et cetera, they're already there, right? I've even seen that happen for teams that we were just talking to a team that's trying to redesign their entire site by the end of the quarter. They're still trying to define the patterns. And we're thinking of it as more or less waterfall or Wagile. It's all waterfall, let's be real. And what we started, by working around the central source, what they've started to embrace is, we could actually start building the system, the application with incomplete components, as long as the mechanisms by which we're managing and inheriting them are all set, right? So we know how we want to work. We're going to start building, and then those components are going to keep getting improved, but we've already got everything set up to pull those in. So now getting your design and component perfect is not a blocker to building the application, because again, it's more about how we work than about stepping through all the stages to get all the things perfect before we move on. Which to me is what moving production towards to be more appropriate for digital and the medium of destination. That's what it's all about, right? With posters, we needed to wait until we got things right before we printed them.
Right, you only got one shot at that printer.
Do that anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Gloss and margin are not our only concerns, but it also is a lot of flexibility here now. Yeah. A question from Sandy, which I'm gonna go ahead and answer live. It's clear that building a community is key to engaging contribution. However, from my experience, building a design community is somewhat easy. Building a tech community is hard. Building a design tech community is tough. Curious about your experience and your opinions around this. I definitely have them, but we've got one of those tech folks on the line, so I want to hear his thoughts around how do we build community with, a truly collaborative, cross-functional community around this kind of stuff.
So one of the biggest things that I've seen, sort of the kind of fiefdoms that spring up around the design system, really, if we want to talk on the tech side, it really does come down to like, what will we be implementing this in, right? What's the language? What's the templating system? And one of the first things that we did with Knapsack was ensure that there are multiple types of languages that can be used and be featured, because that's where these camps kind of spring up in tech communities. Like, well, I'm the Angular person, well, I'm the React person, well, I'm only CSS, right? And they kind of have their areas they're working, and anything that can kind of bring those folks together around a common cause, the same UI, the same workflow, right? That helps people win. That gets adoption, that gets the community some solidarity.
No, I love that. I would also add on that, I think we're a little bit biased here at Knapsack. I often talk about being a foot and a half in the engineering world because of part of our roots, right? We came from a platform engineers built to make it easier to build and manage reusable components. But also, at the end of the day, our customers are touching code, right? It's not a poster, right? They're touching a coded experience. So what I advocate for, especially design leaders, is to go to the engineering partners and say, I want to talk about how we can reuse more code as an organization, right? And their ears perk up, right? I think the space we're in necessitates us having that special appreciation for the code side of the world, and leaning into that and showing that we're willing to lean into that often is the olive branch that we need to get, just to break down the assumptions of, well, they're trying to tell me to do designy stuff and we know how it works. And it's a simple but powerful thing to kind of bring the conversation to them. And it's why we lean so much into Git, right? We use Git under the hood of Knapsack because Git does what it does really well, and we don't need to solve that problem again. And it builds trust with our cross-functional partners.
And here's just a quick little anecdote around the design and the dev teams kind of coming together in the same community. It's going to sound weird, but showing an energy to remove, to actually we all know that once we get color tokens defined, they tend to pile up, right? You can start with your 5 main colors, they become 36 colors by the end of the process. To show that there's actually an iterative approach of being able to remove and take stuff out, like take some colors out, right? That shows a systems level thinking on both the design team, the tech side very much appreciates, right? Being able to take that stuff out, reduce the complexity. It is a good step toward getting the energy those two teams need to work together.
Absolutely. Folks, I want to acknowledge, I know we are at the top of the half hour. We have some more time, so we can certainly stick around. There are some other questions. Cassie, I know you had your hand up earlier. If you still have a question, feel free to reach out to us at hello@knapsack or drop it in the chat. I do see a question from Sylvia, which we'll get to, but if you have to jump, totally fine. Thank you so much for joining us. We will send out some information about the recording and the deck once the internet gives it back to us. Shana, anything you want to add there before I just pop back on with some questions? Oh, can't hear.
Oh, you're muted, Shana.
She's not muted. I just can't hear. Zoom's not cooperating with Shannon. That's okay. Check us out on our blog. We'll post some wonderful information about this. Maybe something she said. Awesome. Sylvia's question around token advice about naming tokens. Our chief architect has been known to say naming things is hard, right? And naming things simply and in a way that everyone will understand is hard. There are certainly a lot of suggestions and frameworks out there. My recommendation for this type of thing always is to go back to my sort of UX research principles and say, who's going to use the thing, right? The number one most important thing is that it makes sense and is usable for the people that need to use it, right? Most of us aren't building material here. We're not trying to hope thousands, millions of people can just pick it up and use it. We're probably supporting our product team first and foremost. So I would do some research planning exercises, right? Go do some A/B testing with them. Try and understand what's going to make the most sense. It's a fluffy answer, but it's always the place that I start, because if the people who need to use the system don't understand it, then it doesn't really matter how pithy the names are or whatever else,
And just my 2 cents on the naming side of it. We used to in the past try to ensure that all token names were as like super generic as possible, and they didn't mention the color, primary, secondary, tertiary. That is fine if it works for a team and you have a smaller subset. That's great. But with the modern tooling that we have today, don't be afraid to call something color red 500. Don't be afraid, because refactoring that out, changing those values, being able to find and replace that kind of stuff is vastly easier today than it has ever been. Yes, I have been on projects where the red 500 became brown and suddenly like all references to, to red had to become red in the past, but it's much, much easier to get those sort of changes in place today than it was before.
Yeah, I remember a year or two ago, we had an event about tokens, and the team from Adobe Spectrum spoke about how, for their users, what was most helpful was being able to name things with excruciating detail about the context in which it was used, to the point where they had 150,000 tokens in production and only about 400 to 450 raw base values. But you know what? But they had some tooling around how they constructed that stuff semantically based on use case. It mapped it. I'm like, at the end of the day, it's some references in JSON. It's not that hard to add another layer when you need to have it be called brown instead of red. So it certainly doesn't work for every team, but some teams that just is terrifying. But again, why I say, let's talk to the users first and see what.
Talk to the users. If you have that flexibility on your team, that's a good sign of design systems team health.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that is the questions we have so far. Again, always love hearing from everyone. As you can tell, we like talking about design systems with folks who think about these things. Please never hesitate to reach out to us at hello@knapsack.cloud. Visit our site, check out our blog. We'll post this. I know you won't be able to miss it. We like posting our content. So thanks again for showing up, everyone, and we'll see you out there.
Thanks all.
Take care.